Same place, or is this copies?
Okay, welcome everybody to the first of what we hope will be a year-long series of seminars devoted to the Cérémonies et coutumes religieuses de tout le peuple du monde, or the religious ceremonies and customs of all the people of the world, as it will be referenced in this paper, because we're talking about the Anglophone world. I'm JB Shank. I'm a faculty member here at the University of Minnesota. I'm also the project director of a National Endowment for the Humanities Digital Humanities Advancement Grant, DHAG, that's devoted to the ceremony and its history. And the idea of these seminars is to advance our work with the CCR, as I will always call it. With Mark, you get the CRC instead. It's the same book. And by inviting scholars who are currently working with the book to give papers contributing to our work and to all of our work with this book. So we have the first of these is Mark Valeri, who I'll introduce here in a minute. But before we get started, I just want to go through with everybody how we are going to use the Zoom interface. I'm going to bring Mark up into this spot very quickly, and he will be in charge of the intellectual side of the meeting. But I'll be right next to him at my Zoom command post. So if you have any questions, if particularly sound is not working well for you, or any other thing, please let us know. The way we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask you all now to mute your mics and keep it muted for the duration of Mark's presentation. This is an interactive live meeting, and we will have hopefully lots of back and forth once Mark has set us up. So keep it muted now. And you can also turn off your mic or your video. Mark is looking at the boxes, and if you have your picture there, he sees you. If he sees a black square with your name, he sees that. It's nice. I know for people who I've done these myself, and others have said the same thing, that it's nice to look at faces rather than black squares, but people have internet bandwidth issues. So you're totally in control of your camera there. You can put it on or put it off. Maybe when it comes question time, it would be nice to put on the camera, but you can keep it on afterwards. Moving along, you see the participants menu. The chat then occurs. What we're doing, Mark, rather than share some slides, we've put the chat to a couple of the images he'll reference. He prefers, and it probably is easiest, to just hopefully you'll have the paper. If he's going to refer to an image, or if you're going to refer to an image, just refer to the paper and the page number, and we'll do that way rather than trying to share screens in this way. So go to the chat to see images, or follow Mark's directions to the paper. And then I see we're recording this meeting. I should say that this is in conjunction with the American Society for 18th Century Studies, which has a YouTube channel, and all of these meetings, these sessions will be recorded and then will be available later for viewing as just a static webcast via ASEC. So there. My eyes are failing me here. I simply wanted to alert you to the reactions button there. I guess it's at the far right. Yeah, there you go, the far right. When it comes time to have the Q&A, the interaction, the way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask you to indicate to me that you have a question by using the raised hand function, which is under reactions. I'll, like I say, be right here. I will get the request, and I'll moderate so that we can go one after the other and do that. And at that point, obviously you unmute and perhaps turn on your mic, and then Mark will respond through the Zoom interface. Let me just see now if there are any quick questions I can answer or not. Hopefully not. Good. I just point, we all are pretty experienced Zoom users. So with that, let me turn it over then to Mark by introducing him. Mark is the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neaves Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics at Washington University. His areas of specialization include religion and social thought, especially economics in America, Reformation theology and the political history of Calvinism, Puritanism and Enlightenment moral philosophy. He came to Washington from Washington University from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, where he served as the Ernest Trice Thompson Professor of Church History beginning in 1996. Before that, he was in the Religious Studies Department at Lewis and Clark. His most recent book, Heavenly Merchandise, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, won the 2011 Philip Schaff Prize from the American Society of Church History, and other awards as well. Previous books by him include Law and Providence in Joseph Bellamy's New England, The Origins of the New Divinity in Revolutionary America, and co-edited book with Lee Schmidt, Global Neighbors, Christian Faith and Moral Obligation in Today's Economy. He's won prizes from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, American Council of Learned Societies, and others. He gave a cover page to his paper explaining this most recent book on how Anglo-American Protestants describe other religions and develop new ideas of religious conversion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark to take it from here.
All right, thank you, JB. Thank you everyone for being here. An amazing thing that ASEX and the University of Minnesota Early Modern Studies has put together this project on Bernard and Picart and the English version CRC or the French version CCR. An extraordinary affirmation of the discipline of classical humanities in my mind, which I find very, very pleasing. So I hope you were able to access the paper. I'm going to talk about 15 minutes now and introduce the context for the paper, which is really a chapter of a book now, and maybe do a quick summary and read through the chapter for those of you who
Okay, you were muted. So
the whole thing was muted.
the whole thing was muted. I'm sorry.
Okay.
to
No,
hear
it's all right.
this. Yep, I'm sorry to hear that. Yep, but I think you're all set. Do people now hear?
Yeah, if you're live, wave your hand if you can hear me.
Yeah.
All right, good, great. Thank you so much. So we'll start over. I gave lots of words of appreciation for this project, and I still feel a great deal of appreciation for this project and ASEX and the University of Minnesota, JB, and for putting this amazing study investigation together. The paper you read is a chapter of a book that's not solely about Picart and Bernard, but about the rise of the study of the world's religions, or what we might call comparative religions, in the 17th and 18th century in the Anglo-American Protestant world. Its focus is chiefly on London and Boston, and the center narrative of the paper tracks a change, a cultural change connected to political issues, so that when one reads in 1660, Alexander Ross, one of the first authors of a dictionary of the religions of the world in English, it takes a confessional approach. This confessional approach assumes that England is a Protestant kingdom, that all nations have a religious identity that's attached to a specific set of religious institutions. It has a national confession, and therefore all religions that aren't mainstream magisterial Protestant, excluding radical Protestantism, that all religions that aren't mainstream radical Protestant are disloyal to the kingdom and therefore illicit. And so strong language for those other religions, superstition, idolatry, devilry, is attached to them because it conveys not only a theological judgment, but also a political judgment, being disloyal to England. By 1730 or so, much of this discourse has changed, and the studies on the world of religion have changed. Authors such as Thomas Broughton, who is the center of the previous chapter to this chapter on Picart and Bernard, they have detached, after the Revolution of 1688, the Williamite Revolution in England, have detached the kingdom's identity from any particular religious profession. There's a broad-based Protestant assumption, but the notion that theological creeds and a close detailed religious practice is the definition of being English is largely minimized and is replaced with what I call a Whig moralism, a language that connects the well-being of the kingdom to certain moral virtues, benevolence, sociability, amiableness, toleration, etc., as a kind of criteria by which to judge different religions and their expressions. So that different religions are not judged in whole in these new set of dictionaries, are not judged as a whole, good or bad, theologically sound or not, English or not, but they're judged in their specific parts. Which communities are coercive, use state power, and to enforce their legitimacy and the legitimacy of an absolute ruler, as opposed to those traditions which are more nuanced and investigate different religious communities according to their embodiment or not of these Whig moral virtues. What provokes this change, I do think, is the rise of a Whig government in the kingdom in England, a Whig government that looks at religious capaciousness in including as many different groups as possible as the strength of the new kingdom, as a tie between London and Boston, where there are dissenting religious traditions. William himself has, relies on Catholic army officers, and some sense that there needs to be negotiation with Catholic states throughout Europe. There is a sense in which this new moralized approach, replacing a confessional approach, has political and imperial mandates. So the question is, can we make Picart and Bernard part of this story? And perhaps in the process, have a line of reading through all 7 volumes of CRC that links the different images and the different essays by Bernard into something like a coherent whole. What links these different sets together, rather than specific or just discrete conversations about different religious communities and traditions. So if you look quickly at the images in the chat, they are the first 2 images that appear in the chapter. One is the image of the canonization ceremony of Clement XI. And you can see it evokes awe, it evokes grandeur, and it evokes power. And next to this image, Bernard talks about Clement's suppression of the Jansenists through the aid of Louis XIV in France. So political power, ceremony, awe, awesomeness, majesty, grandeur are linked. And then the next page, the image of the Japanese temple, we presume a Buddhist temple. I try to say he reads Japanese Buddhism through this lens of a critique of Catholic ceremonialism. So when Japanese Buddhism is presented, it is presented as the same image, the same space, the same markers, the same public display of power and grandeur. Those of you who have the privilege of looking at these images in the actual books in their original form, one cannot help but be struck by the sheer size of things. These are big buildings, massively tall, and the human beings are very small. And the point is, he reads Buddhism through Catholicism at this stage. And so much of the images in the paper are an attempt to portray something like that. This paper then is about Picart and Bernard and the ways in which they use their images and their essays to portray the danger of ceremonialism, the danger of a certain kind of ceremonialism connected to political power, which is, I think, in British and English Whig agenda as well. So the first part of the paper tries to uncover ways in which Picart, Bernard especially, but a little bit Picart, are attached to the Whig community in England. The way Bernard presents himself is a typical, almost Anglo-Protestant liberal, publishes the works of Tillotson and Samuel Clarke. He might have had personal deist-like sympathies, but he presents himself as an Orthodox Protestant in the way that Tillotson and Clarke were Orthodox Protestants, which is to say they use the language of reasonableness. Their theology is softened, it's moralized at many points, but underneath it all, there is a kind of Trinitarian end of the ball game for Clarke especially. But I think Bernard is simply trying to present himself as an English, he's compatible with English Protestantism. Bernard and Picart also have ties to 1688 to William and Mary, Picart's celebratory engravings of William III, the circles of Whig, English Whig writers in which they move in Amsterdam and The Hague. The magazine that Bernard publishes the works of English Whiggish writers. And when the way they rework some of the essays, Bernard, some of the essays in CRC to remove the pro-Spinoza sort of at least neutral position on libertinism, maybe cryptically positive positions on Spinoza and libertinism. Bernard gets rid of those in the English edition, is sort of say we are valuable for the Whig, English Whig Protestant as well. I think when Bernard writes his essays on ceremonialism, I mentioned in the paper Gordon and Trenchard, and of all things, the Bangorian controversy. And my apologies that those are all talked in the previous chapter. But these are sources for the Whig writers who try to use high church, Tory, and Jacobite assaults on the Whig Hanoverian regime. They refer to those sort of proto-semi-Catholic assaults on the Hanoverian regime, high church Anglican assaults, and want to warn against it. And what they say is the pro-Catholic party in England will try to seduce you through ceremony. It's the high ceremonialism. And I think that Picart and Bernard draw upon this kind of writing, or at least echo, reflect in their approach that this is the way ceremonialism works. Awe and majesty, think of the canonization ceremony of the Pope. Awe and majesty dislodges people from their rational, dispassionate evaluation. It brings a sense of terror to them, and being terrorized by the awesome sense of majesty that's presented in mysterious, magical laden ceremonies, people are willing to give up their autonomous rational judgments and submit to a priestly class which works in conjunction with an absolutist political class. So you listen, you inhabit these ceremonies, your reason is displaced, you were moved by terror into obeisance to priests who tell you to have obedience to the absolute monarch. So absolute monarchy, priestcraft, and high ceremony worked together. That's in Trenchard and Gordon and Trenchard. It's in lots of Whig writings, but I think it's reflected in Bernard's writings as well. So when one comes to CRC, I think the illustrations, the images are Picart's attempt to give readers a sense of the visceral pull of ceremony and use that visceral sense against itself. I think the line from the paper that captures this is that a Catholic sympathizer would look at these ceremonies and say how wonderful, and a good Whig would read these ceremonies and say, look at how awful, and I can feel how awful and dangerous they are. So there are other Whiggish writers, such as George Whitefield, who travels to Portugal and writes some letters back. It's sort of an accidental trip that he's in Lisbon for the Holy Week. And he writes these letters back home about the Holy Week ceremonies in the streets of Lisbon and in the cathedral. And he says, I'm giving you this deep narrative and trying to evoke the sounds, especially the sounds, but also the crowdedness of people, the visuality of all the candles and the tapers and the crowds and the noises, because abstract critique will not capture what's at stake here. You must feel the danger of high church Catholic writing. And at one point in that essay, he says, and when you read this, you should say, thank God I'm British. Thank God I'm British, instead of this kind of debased Catholicism that's connected to authoritarianism. So when he goes through different religions, I'm almost done here. CRC presents Roman Catholicism as partly a papal Catholicism that's ceremonial and absolutist. That's the discussion of the Inquisition, the massive bureaucracy, the images of the voting cards for the new pope, the materiality of it, the papal election, the papal enthronement, as a warning against a ceremony connected to power. On the other hand, there are many passages which extol Catholics who refrain from the search and grab for power. Jansenists, the church in Venice, Bernard seems to like a lot. And then the pictures of the common mass in which a parish priest sort of delivers it in a simple, straightforward, humane manner. Same thing with Protestantism. There are types of Protestantism which offend and produce Bernard's censure: millenarian Protestantism, ecstatic Protestantism. Other types of Protestantism he finds support these Whig moral virtues. Also with Islam, I relied here in the paper on David Brofman's work, his essay, but also much of his work about the importation of Islamic books into England in this period, that Bernard himself has sort of collected a library of Safavid or Persian Empire authors, Shia writings, and seems to admire them, seems to admire mystical Hermeticism. And so the picture of the Mufti here, which is known as a very, he's respecting the Mufti. It is a picture that's to evoke, if you will, affirmation or assent, as opposed to Sunni, Ottoman, Arabic, Istanbul, Mecca images of Islam as, again, coercive, power, high ceremony, public display, all brought together. Same thing with Native Americans, where he relies on Robert Beverly and talks about the virtue of simple Native American piety, their natural knowledge of God, all of which was ruined, of course, by Algonquian priests with their trick, deceptive ceremonies in order to gain obeisance and power. So reading all religions through this lens of anti-ceremonial, anti-papal reading. And then the end of the paper then shows how New Englanders, especially New England travelers, toward the end of this paper, that they have this very nuanced view towards Catholicism. Partly, obviously critical, but to some extent appreciative of when they think they've encountered Catholics who display Whig virtues. So I'll stop there, having dragged you through the paper yet again, and welcome any and all comments, critiques, questions.
Walter, you see the clause we have there, which allows us to thank Mark for that presentation and for the paper. What we're going to do now is, I guess, with a few people here in the room, if you have questions, use your actual hands. The rest of you, if you see under reactions, there's the raise hand button right there. If you hit that, you come to the top of my list, and I already see Margaret Jacob has done it, so we'll go to her next. But if you want to get into the queue and ask a question, raise your hand and then wait for me to acknowledge you, and then you can unmute and begin to ask your question. So good, I see hands popping in now. So let's start with Peg. Go ahead, Peg. Unmute, Peg.
I learned a great deal from this paper. It never occurred to me to make the juxtaposition between the Catholic imagery and the Japanese. I think you are basically right about a Whig ideology or Whig theology that identifies a set of concepts that line you up as being in favor of Protestantism of a Williamite variety, anti-absolutist, anti-Catholic, of course, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're basically on track here, and I was delighted to read the paper. I have some questions in my mind about how much Bernard and Picart actually knew the sources, the context of this Whig theology. It's not clear to me that they ever read Trenchard and Gordon. I've never seen any evidence to suggest that Bernard and Toland knew one another well. I know that it turns up in the sources here and there, but there's no evidence that I was ever able to find. And I've searched around Toland off and on for years and never been able to establish that kind of link. Similarly, the other sources from the colonies, I doubt that they knew those. But again, I don't have in front of me, the list of Bernard's library that we used, and I don't have it here right now, but it's very valuable. It might help you a bit to pin down where they're getting their thought. Are they getting it directly from visitors with whom they speak? And that would be quite possible. I mean, they are unquestionably in the camp of the British, especially once war breaks out. And indeed, they're in a dangerous situation. Amsterdam could easily have been overrun, and they would have been among the very first to be seen as dangerous, et cetera. So I wonder if you want to comment a little bit more about how you set up the relationship between Bernard and Picart and this Whig theology, ideology, which is there in their work, unquestionably. How did they get this stuff? Where did they learn it? Your views.
Oh, thank you. It is somewhat indirect. It is their movement around the literary societies and clubs. It is Bernard's publication, the journal he publishes, their familiarity, citing Locke, publishing Tillotson. All of these are obviously Whig figures. So I am going to recheck the list of Bernard's library. Thank you for that. And I think you put your finger on a weak strand in this, which is I don't have very strong firsthand evidence that they read people like Gordon and Trenchard. I would be surprised if they didn't pick up this along the way. But I think that's a fair point. it's a little inferential at that part.
Okay, okay, let's Lynn Hunt.
Well, actually, my question is, it follows from Peg's, perhaps not surprisingly. Peg, can you just, can you mute yours? Sorry.
Noise of Zoom.
Can you just Peg, turn off your sound? Because it's echoing.
Oh, yeah.
Mute yourself and turn off your sound.
All right, you're there.
Sorry about that.
All right.
You still have your, oh, thanks. Okay, so I want to just explore a little bit more the same tension, but from a slightly different perspective. And here it seems to me it hinges in part on who does the cutting that you refer to in the English edition, cutting out the Spinozism, et cetera.
Yes.
So that's a really, really interesting issue, because it seems to me that there's no question that there's an affinity between these two positions. The issue is whether, I guess my view is that in the English audience sees this affinity, and the publisher is in a sense kind of wants to solidify that affinity. Whereas when I think of Bernard's own views, Picart's views are opaque because he doesn't really write that much about his views. And I'm not sure what you can actually conclude from the images. I loved your analysis of the images, but about his actual religious views. But Bernard's religious views, I would say, tend more towards, we don't know, towards Spinozism, but certainly towards some notion that there's a primitive core of Christianity that's been lost with the accretions, whether in the Greek Orthodox version or the Catholic version, or even some of the Protestant versions that you talked about, millenarianism, et cetera. So my sense is that Bernard has a view that's compatible with the Whig view, but I don't think it's exactly the same. I think Bernard's own view is actually more radical than theirs would be, because he would certainly be an anti-Trinitarian, I would have thought, which for some people in England would be possible, but is not generally endorsed by the higher authorities. So I think for me, there's a tension between what's in the Picart Bernard view and the English view, that the English translation goes out of its way to efface as much as possible that tension. And then I think it's also, you know this, and everybody who's looked at the volumes knows this, but it's worth underlining that Bernard is an 18th century writer. He's in fact reproducing massive amounts of material from other people. And then he's putting in his own views. And it's not always easy to figure out what's his view and what it is. Just he's decided this is, oh, okay, this is the book I've got on this subject, and that's what I'm going to reproduce here. I mean, he's looking for the best sources, but he hasn't seen everything. And so he has a kind of what we would consider a kind of slapdash view towards putting these things together. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because it means there's all kinds of room for different interpretations, misinterpretations, which I think is deliberate on his part, because he's not going to sit down and say, this is my religious view, because it's problematic. I'm sorry, that was a little bit too long. Sorry for taking up so much time.
No, it's very, very helpful. It's great. And I think it raises two questions. One is the kind of technical book history question that is, what happened in the making of the English edition? Who was responsible for it? Was Bernard in some way responsible for approving of it? What sort of arrangements were made? Who's being who is cutting out Spinoza, so to speak, and how? And I don't know the answer to that, Lynn. And so it raises a great question. Right, well, if you don't either, then I feel a little better about that. So second for me, I'll say something after this too. And second, for me, that means to soften the language. This is for my own, personal, quite selfish uses. To soften the language that this is not Bernard, but this is the English edition of CRC, which is doing this. And that's very helpful to make that distinction. But the third thing is it does raise the larger question about the use of dictionaries and encyclopedias and how they take large excerpts, and that's how they put it together. And it is really hard to tease out when they are simply saying, I've got these 10 pages from Robert Beverley on the Algonquians, I'm just going to put it in here. And when it's something else. So I think those are excellent. And what you're helping me do at this point, this is off the discussion of CRC, but it's helping me talk about the volume, the edition, rather than the authors themselves. Thank you.
So I see Peg up again. Is it just to continue with this? We got a number of other hands, but I'll give you a chance to say a little bit more if you'd like to. Is that...
I'm just, I want to add one point. You may recall that when Picart's father-in-law would about to become father-in-law, wrote to a close personal friend. He said, my son-in-law, God help us, is a man with no religion. Geen religie. Another way to approach this might be to say, these guys are, they're not Christians in any fundamental sense. They've somehow gone out there into the great wild of free thought. And instead what they're doing is piecing together an ideology that is in favor of, that relates to all of the assumptions that one has to make to be a Protestant in the early 18th century and to establish an identity.
I can just real quickly, these are extremely helpful. And what I want to say, it seems to me that there is something emerging in the Anglo-Protestant world at this time, which is a broad-based Protestant consensus, which in an odd way includes a very almost not Christian deism. I mean, it's just on the border, it's on the cusp, one way or the other, how you read it. It includes that. And even evangelicals will say, when it comes to Britain's public religion, these people are okay because they support these Whig virtues and they will not molest, if you will, Orthodox Protestant teaching in certain ways. So I do think that one could find Bernard being a personal unbeliever or deist in a very hard and strict sense, but still approve of religious traditions which have Orthodox Trinitarian teaching, say, but do so in a sociable, polite, non-coercive manner. Does that make sense? Okay, good.
Okay, I saw Anne's hand up earlier, but now it's down, and also Robert Twist. Is that because you don't have a question, or?
I do have a question, I think.
Go ahead, Anne, and then
Okay.
Robert, and then I see Andreas, your hand's up still.
Okay, so thanks, Mark, very much. I enjoyed that greatly. And I've got a couple of interrelated points. The first has to do with the question of the technical book history edition of this work. I was curious in reading your paper, what aspects of the original, that is French language presentation of Catholicism, got edited out or otherwise modified. when it was translated. You seem to be suggesting at one point that Bernard was doing that work, but it is hard to find evidence of that this was his work rather than that of a translator. And I'm mentioning it in particular because I am working on the Jansenist convulsionaries, and I've compared the presentation of them in different editions, and it's very striking. If you look at the English translation, how much it gets truncated out. It's reduced significantly, as if that's just not really interesting to an English-speaking audience. So I'm sort of wondering whether other points that you're drawing from the English translation regarding Catholicism have been modified in some way. Of course, that would require going back into the French, that is the reliable French edition. I would also say that the Catholic editors, Bagnier, Masquier, in the 1740s also did a lot of adulteration to the discussion of the convulsionaries. So obviously I'm somewhat obsessed with the French convulsionaries because that's what I'm working on, and that's how I'm getting at Bernard and Picart. And I think it's important to get to that, which is another suggestion, to nuance somewhat your account of Bernard's relationship, particularly to Jansenism, because there is a very significant discussion of the French convulsionaries. They come right after this group that it is just at that point Bernard who is producing it's what's called the fourth tome or the sixth volume of this work. It comes right after a presentation of the so-called English convulsionaries, who are the French prophets who are exiled Huguenots from the Cévennes area in France. So he's creating an alliance between them, and he's saying the same thing about the French convulsionaries that he says about these fanatics who are displaying the same sorts of negative emotionalism, zealotry, and excessively physical expression of religion, etc. So there, I mean, he does make a distinction between reasonable Jansenists and this group, but he is paying attention to that group.
So that's very helpful. But are you saying then that in the French edition there is material that's more critical of the possibility of Jansenism going extreme than there is in the English edition? Is that it?
I guess I got muted again. Okay. Yes, I am still exploring that, but what the English translator does is simply tell the English readers that you can go and look yourselves without really citing one of the major sources that Bernard uses, which is this pro-convulsionary for a time periodical called Les Nouvelles Ecclésiastiques. He says, just go and read that. If you want to know more about this, you can also look at the opponents to the convulsionary movement if you want. Whereas Bernard cites the sources. There's doctors who are among the opponents. He cites them very precisely. And all of that gets cut out of the English translation.
That's very interesting and helpful. And it would, if we were, once we go down the line into this Bernard and Picart writing together in our projects, I think an issue, it seems to me, is going to be, let's say, English edition, French edition, representing different, because of the way they're edited and put together, these very sorts of issues, helping read them in that context, which I feel like I've not run across a very strong systematic discussion along those lines, and the Dutch version as well. You know what, right, how that changes as well. Yeah.
Maybe this is a time to chime in. I see Andrews, David. I don't know, Robert, if you do have a question, put your hand back up to indicate so. But it might be a time to put on my project director hat and say a few things.
Yes.
Anne Vila is going to be talking about exactly this topic in December as the third of our series. Excellent. So if you want to hear more about what Anne's saying here, please come back in December. Let me just echo what our research is finding along the lines of the distinction of the different editions. I'll say it in its most aggressive terms, but I'll also say it as it's a working hypothesis. We're starting to ask the question whether there really ever is something like a first edition of the CCR. The book is basically produced originally as a subscription publication, which is common. And we have a lot of evidence that pieces of it are getting out in all different forms. We've found in libraries all kinds of different collections of texts that appear in the library catalog as the CCR in its full, including various kinds of Frankenstein editions, sort of assembling this way. I would say that our sense that the English edition, I mean, you cite in your notes actually the parts in the book that changed Europe, the BTC as we call it, the Bible here, where they're talking about the way Bernard works as a publisher, which is through piracy, reprinting. Again, this isn't scandalous. This is the basic rules.
Sure.
All accounts seem to be that the English edition is some version of the same, in the same way that the Amsterdam French edition is an assemblage of all kinds of things. And as you say, the question of the Dutch edition is an open question at this point for us in terms of whether it is just a translation of the French edition or its own version as well. I'll also say one thing, and I'll stop here and then move on, but I'll come back to this. But you note the abridged English edition, which is a really interesting one, because what happens there is Picart disappears. You can't do a one-volume abridgment and have 263 lavish engravings.
Right. And
so thinking about this text, then your paper does this, but might want to draw this out, thinking of the book as simultaneously a book of text in which it's intertextual, but also intervisual, which is to say that Picart is doing his own work that may or may not be in tandem, like lockstep with what's happening textually in this sense. So, but I'll come back to that. I have a question about that coming there, but I see a whole bunch of other hands we'll go to here.
Fair enough.
So, okay, I'm just going to go with my hand. So I'm going to go to also, Robert, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, I will, if that's all right. I put my hand down because you said you almost answered my question. So now I'll try to ask it in the most specific way I can. It's a two-part question. At the end of your chapter, first of all, thank you so much for sharing this chapter with us. I really enjoyed it. At the end, you talk about, in the English version of the CRC, how the different religions are viewed in their heterogeneity. They're able to make judgments about certain aspects and other aspects. And so I want to ask you a two-part question. The first part is, to what extent is this ability to see different religions and judge different parts of them differently, to what extent is that a feature of this Whiggish, the Whig anti-Catholicism that you're talking about elsewhere? Part two of this question is, how much does this in real life, not hypothetically, how much does this create spaces where sort of Protestant rhetoric and deist rhetoric and or free thinking rhetoric can fit together? Do you know if how much does it allow Protestant writers to be a bit spicy or free thinkers to be a bit more acceptable, more palatable? Is that clear? I'm sorry, it's quite a lot, but.
Well, let me answer, and then you tell me where I misunderstood. The first, remind me the first part of your question again.
Is so you've talked about in the CRC the ability to judge different parts of different religions. So certain
right, got it.
Yeah, certain tendencies in Catholicism, tolerance and reasonableness, and these things.
This is a Thomas Broughton's dictionary, which is my other major source from the mid-18th century. 2 volumes, not lavishly illustrated, has one elegant, magnificent frontispiece, akin to the one that from CRC that's mentioned in here. Outside of that, not illustrated, but Broughton does, he'll present entries in this dictionary on contemporary Catholic movements and sectarian groups, in which he's quite laudatory. He never says out front, let us examine Catholicism in its discrete units. Some of it's okay and some of it's not so okay. But it's more as though he'll come up to certain movements or people, for instance, Polish Catholics, for some reason, when he comes on the entrance, they come across really positively in Broughton's terms, because they seem to support toleration. Again, the Venetian Catholic ecclesiastical establishment does as well. And the Catholic narrative really shifts in the 1750s and 60s, which I go into a little bit here. When the papacy turns against the Jesuits and Benedict XIV, the so-called Enlightenment Pope, and New Englanders, they reprint this stuff in their newspapers. That, look at the Catholics, they're not so bad. And so there's one dictionary that comes out in the 50s, I think, that talks about Italy as this place for religious toleration and freedom and reasonableness. And it's a post-Benedict XIV reading of things, which I take to believe that this possibility for nuanced reading within traditions is there and working its way out slowly. Did that answer the first part? I forget about the second.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's slow. And no, did it work on the ground? Is the second part, especially with the nuance, the deists, more orthodox people?
Yeah.
I think this is really our question about the discourse of toleration or sensibility as opposed to behavior is very hard for me to articulate, because there is a sense in which it produces moments of genuineness and mutual respect, moments across the board. With George Whitefield, for example, this evangelical preacher, just goes off on Tillotson as a kind of agent of Satan at one point in his career, because soft proto semi-deist rationalist churchy Protestantism is just the bane of Whitefield's version of Christianity. But he later comes around and says he's a good, faithful Englishman. Read Tillotson. And I think what he's saying, I mean, number one, Whitefield's changed a little bit over his career, but also there's this sense of a public religiosity in which we all, as long as we're tolerant and all can affirm each other, seems to be emerging somewhat in this period. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
So Andres, did we cover your comments? Your hand went down.
Yeah, I basically wanted to reiterate the importance not to conflate the production of the first edition, any remake, translation, whatever you want to call it, but we should also then add the readership, because there are really three levels that are involved. And the other remark was already said, two exiled French Huguenots do not need lessons about iconoclasm from anybody else. They have it in their own blood from the start. So any discussion of influence would be very nuanced. And I think if we sort out the different editions, I think a lot of it will come out of that. It's very difficult to ascribe intentions on a specific level.
Great, thank you. Yep. All right, so then I got David Price, Ben Schmidt, and Michael Gaudio. So go ahead, David.
I hope I'm coming through. I'm traveling today. I'm sitting outside of Starbucks. So can someone shake their head? Yes, are you hearing me okay?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. And actually I'm sitting in a Starbucks in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I mention that because the Hebrew Union College, a couple miles from here, has a spectacular Bernard Picart collection. It's just amazing, the whole, yeah. There's a lot, first of all, let me thank you for your paper. It was really interesting for me to read. A lot of your perspectives are very different because I've based my study really on the French edition from Amsterdam. So I've been pretty narrow-minded in my approach. And I also want to thank the commentators. I really thought some of these points were extremely significant, that there is something a little, we have to keep this in mind, that some of this does look a little quasi-haphazard, the way the texts were selected and put together. Even though obviously, especially for the Jewish volume, which is my specialty, they're very meaningful texts, but it's not that they're not by Bernard. And when Bernard does write about Judaism, to give a little bit more information, he's really copying so much from other writers, probably most significantly Bernard. So authorship is an interesting. You're almost better off using a concept of editorship when you think about writing. It's
Good.
But and then the other and then I want to make a kind of general point to everyone here. I spent about half of the summer going through the books, and I became very dissatisfied with just using the name Picard. I just want to point that out. That the publisher, first of all, Picard died in I think 1733 or so, and the publishing continues after that. But most importantly, the plates are they identified his participation very carefully on the plates. And some of the plates he has nothing to do with, of course. Other plates, he only directed the engraving. That just means it probably just means it's done in his shop, not by him, because if he did the engraving, he says he engraved it, and based on a drawing by someone else. So the drawing's not by him, the engraving's not by him in many cases. And quite often, these artists a couple of them had outstanding careers, and probably deserve to be named. I know it gets a little awkward then because it's just so easy to say Bernard, Picart and Bernard. But I just want to throw that out to everyone, that this would be nice to consider changing a little bit. The other thing I just want to mention is in what I read in your paper, this is really superficial, but I think significant. I noticed it was very obvious to me which ones came from the English edition, which seemed the publication for the English edition seems to have been commissioned by the engraver, a guy named Claude Dubosc, and I've never studied him, but he looks like he's responsible for it, for the publication, not for the printing, and therefore one would think maybe he did the copies, the engraved copies. They're all, his stuff's really, you see the stuff right away. There's all graphic inversion because it's really hard to copy a work of art with graphic inversion. You usually have to use a mirror, or it's really hard. So they usually didn't bother with that. Even Picard himself, when he's copying another artist's work, which he did frequently, for example, the consecration of the Jewish synagogue, he's basing this on de Hoog's famous engraving, and he didn't invert that. So you just get so it comes out left, right, switched in the print. And some of yours are very obviously from the English edition, so that's what you're talking about. But others aren't. So at least one wasn't, and I just wondered if some of those images are mixed up. Some of them, just a cautionary thing. I think maybe some of them aren't from the English version. I don't know if that's possible. And I just want to point. And the English version is also interesting that it doesn't begin, for whatever reason. And this is about the only thing I know about it. It doesn't begin with with Bernard's brief essay on comparative religion. They just jumped right into Leon Modina's presentation of Judaism for that publication, and I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure what you think of that, but I can't remember. They kind of snuck it in somewhere else in the edition, but not at the beginning. But anyway, that's all. I just want to say my main point is just the artists' attributions and it's not addressed to you, it's really addressed to Picart's scholarship on this subject, not addressed solely to you. Thank you very much. It's a great paper. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
David.
David.
David's coming in November, further coming attraction.
Excellent.
Benjamin Schmidt has to run, so I'm gonna let him come in right now and then
Sure.
you can respond. So go ahead, Ben.
Sure, and I think it fits in with David's comments. First, thank you very much, Mark. I really enjoyed the paper, and I really learned a lot about the English context, about which I knew rather little, it turns out. And second, I wanted to also thank the commentators. I completely agree about well, I guess you said it yourself, about nuancing the approach and speaking about the addition rather than Bernard and Picart. The Buddhist temple, what's called the Temple of Japan, I'm guessing is from the reigning book on Japan, which was a book by a guy named Arnaldus Montanus. And then he had nothing to do with the graphic works. It would have been by a guy named Jacob van Moers. So that's where that came in. I think your juxtaposition is really great. I would think, however, about where these things come from, because what you really have is a grandiose style that was common around 1670 or so, when that would have been made. It's sometimes amazing to me to think about the 60, 70-year jump between when these products are made and when they then appear as this book which dazzles the eyes. And that was where I was going with my question. It's something I picked up, I think it's on page 10 of your text, where you talk about the images, how central they are. That's not what you're saying. That's an obvious point that we all know about, how central they are to the project and how they dazzle the eyes. And you make a quick and I think to the point comment that this is a bit of a paradox, that in a discussion about how ceremonialism and sensuality and all the things that you're saying that Bernard is maybe making a case against, all of that is in fact materialized, quite literally materialized, by this amazing volume. And that leads to an actual question rather than just a comment. One, I wondered if you can speak to this paradox, to this luxurious product, this amazing bit of materiality, this work that I, in some previous work, have called glibly a coffee table book at the dawn of the age of coffee. In the sense that it really would have been collected there. You mentioned the 800 copies, which is 1,000 copies is quite a few. It's a pretty large print run in this time period, but it's a book that would have been acquired by those who wanted to see these pictures, who wanted to engage with the materiality, the sensuality, the dazzling of the eyes. And that seems to be paradoxical, or at least runs contrary to the kind of rhetoric that you're ascribing to Bernard, in one way or the other would be sensible from a certain kind of Protestant and certainly Calvinist perspective. And the word iconoclasm was thrown out before. There are icons in this book. The next follow-up question is the one-volume English edition, which I know very little about, and I think reading about it made me think about it. I think it was JB or somebody mentioned that it would not have had the tons and tons of images. Right. So I wonder if that English volume is really the vehicle for the arguments, in a sense, that you're making. And again, I say this out of ignorance. I don't know that English volume, but it might be interesting to look at how that English volume is making the whiggish Protestant arguments that you're suggesting, doing so stripped of or largely without some of the sensuality of the 7 or 8 or however many volumes these other editions were. And I come from this, by the way, from a more of a Dutch background, knowing the Dutch and the French editions, but certainly knowing that world of Dutch publishing where these sorts of large, luxurious volumes were the thing. And they were admired precisely for the numbers of images, the size of the images, the dazzling of the eyes that you bring out. Anyway, 2 bona fide questions in there.
Well, on the first part, the paradox of dazzling the eyes and trying to give an argument that being dazzled is a bad thing, right? So I think the phrase I use in the paper is that they try to turn the visceral experience against itself. So I think part of this connects to the moral philosophical language of the period, in which moral judgments, this is post-Locke, this is the beginning of common sense moral teaching, Francis Hutcheson, and I know that Bernard and Picart aren't immersed, I suspect, are not immersed in that. But I do think that in Protestant teaching across Europe, the notion of moral judgment includes a fair amount of emotional engagement, to be affected by, to have one's perceptions changed as the key to the change of one's moral judgments. The moral judgments are not abstract, Lockean moral rationalism, but they involve a kind of perception and affection, disposition toward the loveliness or unloveliness, the attractiveness, the unattractiveness of things. So that's a long way, but let me just hint to say that it would not be incongruous for a mid-18th century religious commentary to try to invoke or provoke a sensory experience as part of a moral judgment. So again, back to the George Whitefield, the trip to Portugal, Lisbon part of this. Whitefield says that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to teach his readers back home to love British Protestantism and to be afraid of those crypto-Catholic Tories and high churchmen in England. Because look what I saw in Lisbon, and look what I heard, and look what I smelled. Is it's amazing prose there. I mean, after a while, you begin to hear and smell and see after reading this for a while. So that's my first run at the first part of your question. That there is a sense in which materiality and ceremonialism is bad when it dislodges moral judgment and overwhelms with the sense of terror and obeisance to authority figures, especially priestly authority figures, which are in cahoots with absolutist sovereigns or magistrates. But all moral judgments are filled with some manner of emotional, perceptual engagement in the moral philosophy of the period. That's a first run at that first part of your question. Although I think the overall notion of paradoxes. Go ahead.
So is that to say that there are good pictures / sensual experience and bad pictures / sensual experiences?
Yes. So the picture, yes. So the picture of the Mufti, which is one of the most famous ones, which just evokes calmness and sweetness and rational, dispassionate judgment. Those are a kind of sensual, emotional dispositions. And yet they're positive because they're displaced from power, they're private. There's nothing in Bernard and Picart that would sort of cut against that. I think Michael has something.
Well, yeah, can people hear me talking? Okay, because I had exactly the same question that Ben did. And but to come back to Ben's point about are there good pictures and bad pictures, and I'm not so sure it would be a question of that being, the Mufti being a good picture versus the elaborate interior of St. Peter's or whatever being a bad picture. I think that, I really liked your answer, Mark, about how there's this question of, forming a judgment about the picture, that maybe the way of thinking about the role of the pictures in these books is, or maybe we need to think more about the role of the pictures. I mean, what you laid out so great in your paper is a message, whiggish message to this text. But I mean, what I think this conversation is suggesting is that the book itself is more of an experience. We have to think about it more as an experience, right? The question of how do you deal when you're presented, as you talk about, with this morally provocative picture? How do you deal with it? I'm not sure if it's a question if it's a good picture or it's a bad picture. It's a problem, right?
Okay.
The whiggish message is there to help you think about how you deal with it, how to raise your eyes, as Bernard talks about, to what's most sublime and mysterious in religion, rather than getting stuck on the lavish image itself. So the images come to play a really powerful role in that sense, right? And so what all this is suggesting is a kind of, it's a coffee table book, it's lavish, it's this rich ornate thing, but it's also a kind of trial, right? Presented to the viewer. I mean, you have to make sense of these images, right? You have to arrive at the right kinds of judgment.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So, and Ben, your comments were, I think he's
He
gone.
had to go, he said
Oh.
he was running late. so that's why I
Absolutely,
squeezed
he's absolutely spot on. Wonderful comments.
Yeah.
But I'll follow up with Michael. But yeah, so there are some pictures. So let me modify your nuanced suggestion. There are some pictures which are meant to evoke revulsion. The picture of the auto de fe in the Portuguese Inquisition, where they have people burning. I mean, I think that's not to evoke moral ambiguity, right? It's a little different with my reading of the parish mass, the priest performing the parish mass, and the mufti, the Islamic teacher, where I'm saying this is stuff that's supposed to evoke pleasant moral feelings. And pleasure in early-ish mid 18th century moral philosophy, pleasure is part of moral judgment. It is integral to moral judgment. Francis Hutcheson has to sort of defend himself against the charge that he's merely talking about a kind of hedonistic pleasure. And he says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. So I'm not sure I'm coming back to what you're saying, except are you suggesting that the reading of the images should be less absolutist and tied to a particular position?
No, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't disagree with your reading of that picture. I think it shows a kind of ideal to which they're asking us to aspire. This is how we should be, right?
Yes.
We should be looking up, right? Rather than so and again, maybe it's an image then that is in some sense sort of teaching us how to deal with the other pictures that are, as you're suggesting, are many of which are clearly meant to provoke revulsion. Just as you pointed out, the Whitfield's experience in Lisbon provoked revulsion for him from actually attending these ceremonies.
It's worth contemplation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we do have other hands up, so maybe we'll
For sure.
just get more on the table. So go ahead, Paula. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you. Thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed this. Hi. Yes, I guess I wanted to add on to Michael's point. I think there is a very elaborate system of in the way this is signed, actually, the Jewish illustration with this dessiné d'après nature. So that is even more particular, because he really invents that, and then there is invent it and sculpts it. And so I think the suggestion, in my opinion, is that there is not just a text compilation, but also a visual compilation, and that he, in a way, is he's responsible for the whole visual conception. And I think that partly the idea of showing what you're talking about, though you're criticizing, is precisely to, at least at a certain level, make the argument that there is an anthropological need for rituals and ceremonies. And so if we're showing, if you look, for instance, at some of the American rituals of marriage, of birth, of the funeral, and then you realize that they look somewhat similar to the ones you may have for the Catholics or the Jews or India or any other place, I think that should make you think about the fact that this is about something else. And you need to see that, and you need to see the superficiality to a certain degree of the pure form, which is something that is attacked in this introduction, as why would it be important to bow or to be dressed in green or to repeat a prayer, right? All these things they criticize as unnecessary for pure religion are what they then show as something that is said by mostly by the priests of all these religions to be so very particular to their religion, when in fact it isn't, because they can produce evidence in a way that it is not, that it is the same all over the world. And this visual repetition in a way, or to a certain extent repetition on the level of the type of ceremony, is important. And then the other point, I think, yes, that to really look at all the various sources, because I think it's not just a matter of Picart or his whole entourage copying a source, but that the sources, say, for instance, Athanasius Kircher is not just somebody who presents illustrations, he presents a whole discourse on religion and idolatry. So I would argue that the people that looked at those volumes at the time did not just see an image of, I don't know, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, they saw the image within Kircher's argument about idolatry. So they saw a discourse, not just an image. And I think this then makes it more interesting to look at those images and the way Bernard and Picart, I would still say, in a way, as directors of at least that first edition, and even including the Muslim volume that was published after Picart's death, but partly, I think, selected still by him, just on the level of, you know, Reland, Feriol, the image of the dervish you mentioned. All of those images were known already. And I think he partly was one, at least, of the people who decided what should be taken and what not. And the whole selection, iconographic selection, is quite interesting a topic. Sorry, this was more a comment.
While we're pulling up another answer, do you know Jonathan Sheehan's work on idolatry? Yeah, that fits, what your comments just rang me there. This discussion of idolatry, which has all these other connections out there. So that's very good.
Yeah. I don't see any other hands, but I have been saving my question, so maybe I'll ask it. We're running out of time. This is good timing here. It really, in a way, comes back to lots of things that already been said, but I'll just sort of say it the way I have been thinking about it. When I started this and saw Gordon and Trenchard, immediately had misty watercolor memories of back in graduate school, sitting at the knee of Keith Baker and reading John Pocock especially, but Bernard Balin, Gordon Wood, Joyce Appleby, who's known to and what it made me think about is the whole theoretical frame that informs that kind of Cambridge School political history of the revolutions, political language, where you work by looking for language paradigms, is the Pocock method, right? You've got the classic, Whig ideology, the Whig stance that he sort of created as a defining paradigm. And then situate actors then in terms of their use or not of that language that's available to them. And it made me think that this might be the way to kind of do what you're doing, because your paper is so rich in showing the way that this work, which, as Michael pointed out, is a kind of site of experience, operates in the different contexts by being a site for then its use by others to do these things. So rather than, so what I guess I'm encouraging you to do is to break away from the idea that you need to worry at all about what Bernard thought or Picart thought. What you have are these extant texts that are out there that resonate in the way you show without, question. There's no doubt about what you're showing. Where things get tricky is, where do they get that information? Why is that resonance there? Which might simply be, question mal posée is the first. You don't need to do that in this way. And I think I'll say the last thing I'll say is, as back to Anne's points, we've gotten into all the ways in which you make a very hard binary between Protestants and papist Roman Catholics.
Yep.
In that way. But then you acknowledge and use very well that there's Jansenists, there's others. When you talk about the Trinitarian question, there's a long history within the Catholic Church, the original Catholic Church, of debating the Arian heresy, right? And Protestantism at one level crystallized some of these through the actual rebellion and creation of a new church. But Jansenism is within Catholicism, and it comes to argue often very similar things. Dale Van Clay, who's written the most about this, resists the idea of shorthand. People want to say, oh, that's just Catholic Calvinism, Jansenism. No, it's its own thing. And yet, in a way, that people say it's Catholic Calvinism because there's very similar arguments there to what are Protestant arguments. And so, going to the CCR and going to Picart in particular, what we know is that a lot of these images Picart did, he starts very much in the French system. And even though he goes to Amsterdam and, does say that statement to his future father-in-law that Peg cites, he retains throughout his life connections to the Parisian world of print and engraving. And it's not at all clear that his move to Amsterdam is 100% religiously motivated. It could very much be a commercial move to try to, and even when he's in Amsterdam, he's still doing work within patronage networks. And so that ceremony scene of the canonization of the Pope in all of its splendor could have very well been produced by him for a Catholic patron, where the whole resonance of it that you're describing was in fact there exactly, but in a positive way, in a way to celebrate the glory of the Catholic Church. And I think these are the kinds of things where, when you try to look at the production side of it, but for your purposes, you're just dealing with reception.
Right.
The fact that what may in a certain Catholic audience be a positive image of the glory of the church and
Yes.
suddenly goes to England and suddenly starts to circulate in this other way. And so it's so we're trying to think of the CCR as a site as much as anything, a site of experience. I like your idea, Michael, of a trial. It kind of provokes us often. It is, as somebody said, it's hard to put it together into a coherent book. And then particularly as we find that buyers will make their own books out of it in many cases. And so all that to say that that's the richness of it. That's what makes it so important and influential. But it doesn't mean that you have to trace trying to trace a determination out of it, I think might be a really impossible or difficult task. So I'll give you final thoughts to wrap us up here.
Well, final thoughts are, I'm just very, very grateful. I mean, this is not my 18th century France is not my bailiwick. And it's 18th century. I pretend to do American history. But I do, so my final thoughts are All right, so what I tried to do is say, can we use this in this argument about changes in the study of the world's religions in this period, in the English context? And what's really been amazingly helpful is all these comments by you people. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming and for the incredibly helpful comments about moderating. And I think I'm coming away with saying, talk about addition more than this and audience kinds of questions.
And useless, how it's been used.
And its usefulness. So that's very helpful. So thank you. This has been great. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So final round of emoji applause here. Yeah, on,
Okay, someone needs the room.
Last year, 12:30.
yeah, okay, we'll be out in 1 minute. We're being kicked out. Let me just simply say, Friday, November 5th, we'll be back in the same Zoom space to hear David Price. That too will be a pre-circulated paper. So prepare for that, and you'll get an announcement from us about that. Otherwise, thank you and be well, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks again, everybody.